After 12 years of single parenting, my twin sons chose their stepmother for adoption, humiliating me in court by saying she was more of a real parent. They had no idea this decision would void their $1.8 million inheritance. When they came crawling back months later, broke and desperate, I told them, "You made your choice. Live with it." Background: my name is David Thompson, and I'm 45 years old. I've been raising my twin sons, Jake and Ryan, alone since they were 6 years old. Their mother, Lisa, abandoned us when her modeling career started taking off in New York. She claimed she needed to find herself and couldn't handle the responsibility of motherhood. For 6 years, I barely heard from her except for the occasional birthday card with a $20 bill inside. I worked as a senior software engineer at a tech company in Portland, Oregon, pulling 60-hour weeks and freelancing on weekends to afford their private school tuition at Cedar Hills Academy, soccer camps, music lessons, and everything else they needed. While other divorced dads got every other weekend off, I was a full-time single parent handling everything from scraped knees to algebra homework to driving them to friends' birthday parties. My father had been Robert Thompson, a successful oil executive who built a small fortune in Texas before dying in a car accident when I was 25. He'd established a substantial trust fund for his future grandchildren, but I rarely thought about it during those exhausting years of single parenthood. The money was there, managed by his longtime attorney Harold Brennan, waiting for the boys to turn 21. It was supposed to be their safety net, their launching pad into adulthood. 3 years ago, Lisa resurfaced with a new husband named Victoria Sterling. Victoria was a stunning woman in her early 40s who claimed to own a successful real estate development company in Seattle. She drove a white Tesla, wore designer clothes, and had the kind of polished confidence that made everyone in the room pay attention when she spoke. Suddenly, Lisa became the fun parent who showed up for weekend visits bearing expensive gifts and promises of luxury vacations. While I was home helping with pre-calculus and driving them to soccer practice in my reliable but aging Honda Civic, Victoria was taking them to Mariners games in her corporate box and shopping sprees at Nordstrom where price tags didn't seem to matter. "Dad, look what Victoria got us," became a regular refrain. Designer sneakers that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Gaming systems I'd been promising to buy when money wasn't so tight. Weekend trips to Vancouver that I couldn't afford to match. I tried not to let it bother me, but the comparisons were constant and cutting. Victoria's house has a pool and a home theatre, Jake would mention casually over dinner at our modest 3-bedroom ranch house. "She says we can redecorate the guest rooms any way we want when we stay there," Ryan would add, looking around our living room with its second-hand furniture and wondering why I couldn't provide the same luxury. Victoria was smart about it too. She never directly criticized me in front of the boys, but she'd make subtle comments that planted seeds of doubt about my choices and priorities. "Your father works so hard," she'd say with practiced sympathy. "It's such a shame he can't find time to enjoy life more. Success should allow for balance, don't you think?" Or, "I've always believed that a parent's job is to open doors for their children, not just pay bills. There's so much world to see, so many opportunities to explore." The boys began staying with Lisa and Victoria more frequently. First it was every other weekend, then entire school breaks, then most of the summer. When they came home, they'd regale me with stories of Broadway shows in New York, wine country tours in California, skiing in Aspen. Experiences that made our local hiking trips and movie nights feel provincial by comparison. "Why don't we ever go anywhere exciting, Dad?" Ryan asked one evening after returning from a long weekend in San Francisco. "We go places," I protested. "Remember our camping trip to Crater Lake last month?" Jake rolled his eyes. "Camping isn't the same as staying at the Four Seasons. Victoria says traveling in comfort is an investment in education and personal growth." I bit my tongue, but inside I was screaming. Everything I did for them, the sacrifices, the long hours, the careful budgeting to afford their needs, was being reframed as inadequacy through Victoria's lens of manufactured abundance. The manipulation deepens. By their junior year of high school, the boys' attitudes toward me had shifted dramatically. They'd started referring to our house as Dad's place rather than home. They complained about having to share a bathroom, about our neighborhood being too quiet, about my cooking compared to the restaurants Victoria frequented. "Can't you get a better job?" Jake asked bluntly one day. "Victoria says software engineers at her level make twice what you do." "My job is fine," I replied, stung by the implication. "It provides everything we need." "But not everything we want," Ryan pointed out. "Victoria says that's the difference between surviving and thriving." I started noticing other changes too. They'd become secretive about their phone conversations, often stepping outside to take calls from Lisa or Victoria. They'd exchange meaningful looks when I talked about college planning or mentioned family traditions. There was an undercurrent of conspiracy that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. The final straw came during their senior year when I found text messages on Jake's phone while helping him troubleshoot a technical problem. The messages were part of a group chat with Lisa and Victoria that went back months. "Lisa, your father means well, but he's always been limited in his thinking. Some people are content with mediocrity. Victoria, the boys deserve so much more. I've been researching their options for college and beyond. There are opportunities available that David simply doesn't have access to. It's embarrassing when he picks us up from school. Everyone sees that old car and knows we don't have money. Victoria promised to take us to visit colleges next month. Real colleges, not just the state schools Dad keeps talking about. I've been thinking about the long-term situation. You boys are practically adults now. Maybe it's time to make some legal changes that would allow me to be more involved in your futures. I've been researching that too. If Victoria adopted them, she could have more say in their education and opportunities. David's been a good caretaker, but they need a real parent now." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. They were planning to have Victoria adopt my sons, the children I'd raised alone for over a decade, so she could upgrade their opportunities. The casual dismissal of my role as their father, the reduction of 12 years of sacrifice to good caretaking, was devastating. But what hurt most was seeing how eagerly Jake and Ryan participated in these conversations. They weren't being coerced or manipulated. They were enthusiastic collaborators in their own abandonment of me. The legal maneuvers begin. 2 weeks later, Lisa called me directly for the first time in months. "David, we need to talk about the boys' futures," she said in her most reasonable voice. "They're 17 now, practically adults, and they need guidance for the next phase of their lives." "They have guidance," I replied. "I'm their father." "You're a wonderful provider," she said condescendingly, "but Victoria has connections and resources that could really make a difference for them. She's willing to take legal responsibility for their education and career development." "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Adoption," she said simply. "Victoria wants to adopt Jake and Ryan. It would give her the legal standing to help them in ways that might be more effective than what you've been able to provide." The conversation was surreal. Lisa was talking about my children like they were assets being transferred between more qualified managers. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I've raised these boys for 12 years. I'm not signing away my rights as their father." "It's not about signing away anything," Lisa insisted. "It's about giving them the best possible opportunities. Victoria has already spoken to admissions consultants at several Ivy League schools. She has contacts in industries that could jumpstart their careers. She's offering them a future you simply can't match. They already have a future. I've been planning and saving for their education since they were born." "David," Lisa's voice turned sharp, "be honest with yourself. You drive a 10-year-old car and live in a house you bought 15 years ago. Victoria drives a Tesla and owns properties in 3 states. Which parent is really better positioned to launch them into successful adult lives?" The argument continued for an hour, with Lisa painting Victoria as a fairy godmother and me as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate obstacle to the boys' potential. When I finally hung up, I felt sick. That evening, I sat both boys down for a family meeting. "Your mother called today," I began carefully. "She mentioned some ideas about your futures that I want to discuss with you directly." They exchanged one of those looks that had become so common, the look that said they already knew what was coming and had already made their decision. "We've been talking about it," Jake said, his tone mature but cold. "Victoria has opportunities for us that you can't provide." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Real ones," Ryan replied. "College consulting, internships at major companies, travel programs that actually mean something. She knows people who can open doors." "And you think I can't open doors for you?" Jake shrugged. "Dad, you're a good guy, but you're not connected. You don't move in the right circles. Victoria does." "She's already talked to people at Stanford and Northwestern about our applications," Ryan added. "She can write recommendation letters that actually carry weight." "I've been planning your college education for years," I protested. "I've saved money, researched schools, talked to counselors." "State schools," Jake interrupted. "You keep talking about state schools and community colleges and student loans. Victoria is talking about Ivy League schools and full rides and networking opportunities. Those things cost money we don't have." "They cost money you don't have," Ryan corrected. "Victoria does." The conversation went on for 2 hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. They'd already made their choice. I was the practical, reliable, boring option. Victoria was the glamorous, connected, opportunity-filled alternative. In their 17-year-old minds, it wasn't even a close contest. "If you really love us," Jake said as the conversation wound down, "you'll want what's best for us, even if it hurts your feelings. And what's best for you is having Victoria as your legal parent?" "Yeah," Ryan said simply. "It is." The courthouse humiliation. The next few weeks were a blur of legal paperwork and family court procedures. Lisa had hired an expensive family law attorney who made the adoption process seem routine and beneficial for everyone involved. I consulted with my own lawyer. But the harsh reality was that Jake and Ryan were 17 years old enough that their preferences carried significant weight with the court. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March. I took the day off work and put on my best suit, a charcoal grey one I'd bought for job interviews years earlier. When I arrived at the courthouse, I saw them waiting in the lobby. Lisa in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Victoria in a perfectly tailored business suit that screamed success and sophistication, and my son's in expensive clothes I didn't recognize. They looked like a successful family unit. I looked like the odd man out. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I asked the boys one final time as we waited outside the courtroom, clinging to that pathetic hope I still had left. Jake looked at me with barely concealed impatience. "Victoria actually cares about our futures, Dad. All you do is work and worry about bills. She's already planning our gap year in Australia and promised to pay for any college we want, anywhere in the world." "When's the last time you took us anywhere that wasn't McDonald's or some discount movie theatre?" Ryan added with casual cruelty. "She understands what success looks like, what we need to compete at the highest levels. She has connections at Goldman Sachs, at Google, at companies you've never even heard of," Jake continued. "She can make phone calls that you can't make, open doors that you can't open." "Not like you," Ryan said, and his tone was almost pitying, "driving us around in that embarrassing car, wearing the same 3 shirts to every school event, always talking about budgets and being practical." The words hit like physical blows. Every sacrifice I'd made, every extra hour I'd worked, every careful financial decision designed to provide for their needs, all of it was being thrown back at me as evidence of my inadequacy. Inside the courtroom, Judge Martinez reviewed the paperwork with practiced efficiency. This was clearly routine for her, another step-parent adoption, another blended family making things official. "Jake and Ryan Thompson," she said formally, "do you both freely consent to this adoption by Victoria Sterling?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jake replied clearly. "This man never understood what we needed to succeed in life. He's been a provider, but Victoria Sterling is the parent we deserve. She has vision and resources and connections," Ryan added. "She can give us opportunities that he simply can't. She understands that success requires more than just paying bills and being practical." "He's just limited," Jake concluded, not even looking at me as he said it. Judge Martinez nodded and reviewed some additional paperwork. "And you understand that this adoption will legally terminate your relationship with David Thompson? He will no longer be your legal father, and you will no longer be his legal children?" "We understand completely," Ryan said. "That's what we want." "Very well. Adoption approved." The gavel fell like a thunderclap, but what came next was even worse. I watched Jake and Ryan embrace Victoria and Lisa with genuine joy and enthusiasm, the kind of excited, heartfelt affection they'd never shown me, even after my biggest sacrifices or most meaningful gestures. Victoria hugged them back with theatrical emotion, tears streaming down her face as she whispered about how happy she was to finally be their real mother. Over their heads, Victoria caught my eye and gave me a subtle, triumphant smirk. It was the look of someone who had just won a game I hadn't even realized we were playing. Lisa nodded at me with what might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Either way, it felt like dismissal. I left the courthouse alone, feeling like 12 years of sacrifice weren't just vanishing, but being actively trampled on. The boys who had once been my entire world, my purpose for getting up every morning, my motivation for every difficult decision, were now legally strangers. And they were celebrating. The secret they didn't know. That night, I sat in my empty house, which felt cavernous without the constant noise and activity of teenage boys, and opened my laptop to check something I'd completely forgotten about during the emotional chaos of the adoption. My father's trust fund account. The account I rarely looked at because it was earmarked for the boys' future, managed by Harold Brennan according to my father's precise instructions, growing steadily through careful investments for the past 18 years. Balance, $1,847,329.47. I stared at the number on the screen, remembering for the first time in years the specific terms my father had insisted on when he established the trust. He'd been obsessed with protecting his legacy from what he called manipulative influences and gold-digging schemes. His own father had lost a family fortune to a series of bad marriages and unscrupulous relatives, and Robert Thompson was determined not to let history repeat itself. With a growing sense of dread and dark anticipation, I scrolled through the legal documents I'd signed 20 years earlier. Most of it was standard trust fund language, but then I found the clause that changed everything. Should the designated beneficiaries cease to be the biological children of David Michael Thompson through legal adoption, emancipation, or other voluntary termination of parental relationship, the trust shall immediately and irrevocably revert in its entirety to the aforementioned David Michael Thompson as the sole surviving heir of Robert James Thompson. My father had specifically designed the trust to protect against exactly what had just happened in that courtroom. He'd anticipated that someone might try to manipulate his grandchildren into severing their legal relationship with me in order to access their inheritance, and he'd built in a nuclear option. If they chose to stop being Thompsons, they'd lose every penny of Thompson money. Jake and Ryan had just forfeited $1.8 million to be adopted by a woman they'd known for 3 years, and they had no idea. I called Harold Brennan first thing the next morning, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "David," Harold said gravely when I explained what had happened in court. "I heard about the proceedings through the legal network. I'm so sorry, son, but you need to know, that adoption just made you nearly $2 million richer." "I found the clause about biological children," I said. "Is it really that simple?" "Your father was very specific about this scenario. He'd seen too many families destroyed by people who married into money and then manipulated children against their parents. The moment Jake and Ryan legally ceased being your children, they lost all claim to the inheritance." "And there's no way around it? No loopholes?" "None. The adoption is legally binding, and so are the trust terms. The money reverts to you immediately. In fact, I should probably initiate the transfer today to avoid any complications." "Harold," I said carefully, "what if Victoria tries to contest this? She's clearly not stupid, and when she finds out about the money—" "Let her try," Harold chuckled grimly. "Your father's estate planning was bulletproof. We anticipated every possible challenge. Victoria Sterling has no legal standing to contest a trust she was never entitled to access in the first place." Within 48 hours, I'd gone from heartbroken single father to wealthy bachelor. The irony was not lost on me. By rejecting me as their father, Jake and Ryan had inadvertently given me the financial freedom I'd never had while raising them. The investigation begins. Something about Victoria's sudden generosity and confidence had always bothered me, but I'd been too focused on the boy's betrayal to think clearly about her motivations. Now, with the emotional shock wearing off and my analytical mind kicking back in, I started asking the obvious questions. How exactly was Victoria planning to afford Ivy League educations for 2 boys simultaneously? How was she financing gap-year trips to Australia and European tours and all the other expensive promises she'd made? Her real estate business was successful, sure, but successful enough to casually spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on someone else's children. I decided to hire a private investigator. Marcus Webb came highly recommended by Harold, who'd used him for estate investigations in the past. Marcus was a former police detective with a specialty in financial fraud cases, exactly what I needed. "I want to know everything about Victoria Sterling," I told him during our first meeting. "Her business, her finances, her background, everything. Something doesn't add up about her sudden interest in my sons." Marcus's initial report came back 2 weeks later, and it was devastating. Victoria Sterling wasn't wealthy at all. Her successful real estate development company was a carefully constructed house of cards built on credit, loans, and deferred payments. She owed $2.3 million to various creditors and was facing foreclosure on her own properties. Her lavish lifestyle, the Tesla, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners and shows, was funded entirely by credit cards and loans she had no realistic way of repaying. But the real bombshell was in Marcus's deeper background investigation. Victoria had done this before. 5 years earlier, she'd married a widower named Richard Crawford in Phoenix, Arizona. Richard had a 16-year-old daughter named Ashley, who stood to inherit $800,000 from her deceased mother's life insurance policy when she turned 18. Victoria spent 2 years convincing Ashley that her father was holding her back and that she needed a more sophisticated guardian to help her navigate college and career opportunities. Ashley eventually agreed to let Victoria adopt her, giving Victoria legal control over the inheritance as her guardian. Within 6 months of the adoption, Victoria had emptied Ashley's trust fund to pay her own debts, then disappeared with a new identity and a fresh start in Seattle. Ashley Crawford, now 23, was still paying off student loans for a degree she'd had to finance entirely herself while working 2 jobs. "Your sons aren't Victoria's first targets," Marcus told me grimly. "They're just her latest ones. She's been researching their inheritance for over a year through Lisa. This entire adoption was planned specifically to give her access to their trust fund." The investigator's report included financial records showing that Victoria had been borrowing money from Lisa for months, using the boys' promised inheritance as collateral for increasingly desperate loans. Lisa herself was in financial trouble, having quit her modeling career for promises of easy money that Victoria had convinced her were coming. "They're both broke," Marcus concluded, "and they just bet everything on money that no longer exists." The confrontation. 3 days after the adoption was finalized, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the caller ID, the first time she'd ever called me directly. "David," she said in her most professional, confident voice, "we need to discuss the transition of financial responsibilities now that the boys are legally my children." I decided to play dumb and see how far she'd go. "What transition?" Well, naturally, any educational accounts, trust funds or inheritance money that was set aside for Jake and Ryan needs to be transferred to my management. I am their legal guardian now, and I take that responsibility very seriously. Oh, you mean the college savings accounts? Those only have about $12,000 combined. The boys can access those directly when they turn 18. There was a pause. David, don't play games with me. The boys mentioned their grandfather left them money for college and beyond. Substantial money. Now that I'm their legal mother, I need access to manage those funds properly. You mean the trust fund? I actually never had access to that money, Victoria. It was always handled by the family attorney, according to my father's specific instructions. Then give me his contact information, she said, and I could hear the steel creeping into her voice. The boys deserve to have their inheritance managed by someone who understands wealth and investment strategies. Of course, I replied cheerfully. His name is Harold Brennan. Would you like his number? I gave her Harold's contact information, knowing exactly what would happen next. Harold called me 2 hours later, laughing so hard he could barely speak. David, I just had the most entertaining phone call of my legal career. Victoria Sterling called demanding immediate access to the boys' trust fund. When I explained that the fund had reverted to you due to the adoption, she went absolutely ballistic. What exactly did she say? She screamed at me for 10 minutes about legal theft and fraudulent documentation and threatened to sue everyone involved in the trust management. When I calmly explained that adoption law is very clear about severing legal relationships, including inheritance rights, she started crying and begging me to find a loophole. And when you told her there wasn't one, she hung up and immediately called back, offering to pay me $50,000 to reinterpret the trust language. When I declined, she threatened to report me to the Bar Association for malpractice. Harold's amusement was audible through the phone. David, this woman is desperate. Whatever scheme she was running, it depended entirely on accessing that inheritance money. Without it, she's financially ruined. The House of Cards collapses. Marcus Webb's investigation had identified Victoria's major creditors, and I made an anonymous phone call to the most aggressive one, a private lending company that specialized in high-risk real estate loans. I simply informed them that Victoria Sterling had recently moved to a new address in Portland and provided her current contact information. Within 24 hours, Victoria's carefully constructed world began unraveling at warp speed. Process servers appeared at Lisa's apartment where Victoria was staying, delivering lawsuits and foreclosure notices. Repo men showed up to reclaim the Tesla and other finance luxury items. Her credit cards were frozen. Her bank accounts were garnished. The Australia gap year evaporated overnight. The promises of Ivy League college funding disappeared. The expensive dinners and Broadway shows stopped completely. Even the designer clothes started disappearing as Victoria tried to sell anything of value to appease her most threatening creditors. Jake called me first, his voice panicked and confused. Dad, something's wrong with Victoria. She's acting crazy, crying all the time, saying she made some kind of mistake. That's not my problem anymore, Jake, I replied calmly. Legally speaking, I'm no longer your father, and your problems are no longer my responsibility. But we need help with college applications. The guidance counselor is asking for financial aid forms and parent information, and Victoria says she can't help us right now. Then ask your legal mother to figure it out. That's what parents do. She's talking about us getting jobs and applying for student loans, Jake continued, desperation creeping into his voice. But that's not what she promised. She said college would be taken care of. Promises change, Jake. Adults sometimes say things they can't deliver. You're old enough to understand that now. Ryan called an hour later, his voice even more panicked. Dad, Victoria says we have to get part-time jobs to help pay for college. She can't afford to help us anymore. But that's impossible. You always said education was guaranteed. I said that when you were my sons, I replied evenly. You chose a different parent. These are the consequences of that choice. Your new mother will have to figure out how to provide for you. But she can't, Ryan shouted. She's broke. She owes money to everyone. The house might be foreclosed. Then maybe you should have researched your new family's finances before you legally joined it. The desperate return. By December, the full scope of the disaster had become clear. Victoria's real estate business had collapsed completely. Lisa had fled back to New York, claiming she'd been deceived and manipulated, leaving Victoria to face her creditors alone. The boys were living in a cramped apartment with a woman who could barely afford groceries, let alone college tuition. Both Jake and Ryan had taken part-time jobs at local retail stores, desperately trying to save money for college applications and future expenses. Their grades had plummeted from the stress and exhaustion of working 20 hours a week while trying to maintain their academic performance. The gap year in Australia had been replaced by the harsh reality of stocking shelves and dealing with difficult customers for minimum wage. Everything Victoria had criticized about my parenting, The focus on budgets, the practical decisions, the emphasis on hard work and realistic expectations had become their daily reality. Except now they were learning these lessons without the safety net of a loving parent who genuinely cared about their well-being. On New Year's Eve, while I was preparing for a quiet celebration with Sarah, a wonderful woman I'd started dating after meeting her at a wine-tasting class I finally had time to attend, my doorbell rang. Jake and Ryan stood on my doorstep, looking exhausted, humbled, and genuinely desperate for the first time in their lives. They'd lost weight from stress and irregular meals. Their expensive clothes had been replaced by thrift store finds. Most importantly, the arrogant confidence that had characterized their personalities during the adoption process was completely gone. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper, tears already forming in his eyes, "we made a terrible mistake." "We believed Victoria's lies about you," Jake added, his own voice cracking with emotion. "We thought you were holding us back from opportunities, but now we understand you were protecting us from people like her." "We want to fix this," Ryan continued. "We'll do anything to be your sons again. We'll work to pay you back for everything we cost you. We'll prove that we understand what you sacrificed for us all those years." I looked at them standing in the cold, these young men who had been the center of my world for so long, who had rejected me so completely, who were now discovering the difference between promises and reality. "You can't fix this," I said calmly, without anger but without warmth either. "You legally terminated our relationship. I'm no longer your father, and you're no longer my responsibility. That was your choice." "But we were manipulated," Jake protested. "We didn't understand what we were giving up. We were just kids making a stupid decision." "You understood enough to tell a judge that I was inadequate," I replied. "You understood enough to say that I embarrassed you, that I was limited, that I couldn't provide what you deserved. You understood enough to choose money and status over loyalty and family." "Please," Ryan begged, actually dropping to his knees on my front porch. "We'll work to earn back your trust. We'll get jobs. We'll pay our own way through college. We'll prove that we've learned from this mistake. Just give us a chance to be your sons again." "Pay me back?" I couldn't help but smile at the tragic irony. "Boys, you have no idea what you actually cost yourselves." The truth revealed. I invited them inside, partly out of basic human decency, and partly because I wanted them to fully understand the magnitude of their decision. Sarah discreetly retreated to the kitchen to give us privacy, though I could see her watching with sympathetic concern from the doorway. "Sit down," I told them, gesturing to the living room sofa they'd spent countless hours on during their childhood. "There's something you never knew about. Something I never told you, because I wanted you to make your own way in the world based on your own efforts, not because of inherited wealth." I opened my laptop and pulled up the trust fund documents, the inheritance paperwork, and the account statements showing the money they'd forfeited. "Your grandfather, my father, was a very successful businessman," I began. "When he died, he established a trust fund for his grandchildren, for you." Jake's face went white as he read the numbers on the screen. That was ours?" "It was," I confirmed. $1.8 million. Your grandfather's gift to his grandchildren managed carefully for 18 years, waiting for you to turn 21. Ryan stared at the screen in complete horror, his mouth moving silently as he processed the implications. "We lost almost $2 million. You didn't lose it," I corrected. "You threw it away. There's a difference. Your grandfather included a very specific clause in the trust. If his grandchildren ever ceased to be his grandchildren through legal adoption or other means, the money would revert to his son, to me." "Can we contest it?" Jake asked desperately, grasping for any possible solution. "Can we hire lawyers? Can we sue to get it back?" "You can try," I shrugged. "But you signed legal documents declaring under oath that David Thompson was not your real father, that you were choosing a different parent who could better provide for your future. You can't have it both ways. You can't reject me as your father and still claim rights to Thompson family money." They sat in stunned silence for 10 minutes, the weight of their decision finally becoming clear. Every promise Victoria had made, every opportunity she'd dangled in front of them, had been funded in their minds by money that was supposed to be theirs. Money that no longer existed for them because they'd chosen to stop being the people who were entitled to it. "Besides," I continued, "even if you could somehow reverse the adoption, which would require Victoria's agreement, and she's in no position to make legal moves right now, the trust specifically states that the decision is irreversible. Once the money reverts to me due to your voluntary termination of our legal relationship, it stays reverted." Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" "Now?" I looked at them with something that might have been pity. "Now you live with your choices. You apply for student loans like millions of other kids whose parents can't afford to pay for college. You work part-time jobs to cover your expenses. You build your own future, instead of expecting to inherit one." "Will you ever forgive us?" Jake asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a long moment. I thought about 12 years of sacrifice, of working extra hours and weekend jobs, of driving them to practices and staying up late helping with homework, of putting their needs ahead of every personal relationship and career opportunity. I thought about the casual cruelty with which they'd dismissed all of that in favor of promises from a woman they'd known for 3 years. "I already have forgiven you," I said finally. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You made adult decisions and now you get to live with adult results. You burned this bridge yourselves and you burned it very thoroughly." "Is there any way?" Ryan started, then stopped himself. "Anyway what? Any way you'd consider helping us financially, even just a loan?" I studied their faces. "Young. I was trying to give them opportunities you couldn't provide. You were trying to steal from them, and you got caught. The only reason you're here now is because you're broke and desperate, just like Victoria." She tried several more approaches, tears, anger, threats, promises of reconciliation, but I remained unmoved. Finally, she left with a parting shot that revealed just how little she understood about the situation. "You've become cold and selfish," she spat. "The David I married would never have abandoned his children like this." "The David you married died in a courtroom when his sons chose money over family," I replied. "You helped kill him." Victoria's final gambit. 6 months later, I received a letter from Victoria herself, the first direct communication since her disastrous phone call with Harold. She was writing from a women's shelter in Tacoma, having lost her apartment and most of her possessions to creditors. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, alternating between self-pity, false remorse, and barely concealed threats. She claimed that she'd been genuinely motivated by love for the boys and had never intended for things to turn out this way. She painted herself as a victim of circumstances, a woman who had made mistakes while trying to help 2 deserving young men achieve their potential. But the real purpose of the letter became clear in the final paragraphs. She was threatening to go public with a story about how I had stolen money from my own children and abandoned 2 teenagers who needed help. She claimed to have contacts in local media who would be interested in the story of a father who had manipulated legal loopholes to profit from his son's mistakes. I forwarded the letter to Harold, who handled it with his usual efficiency. "Extortion is a felony," he told me matter-of-factly, "and her story has more holes than Swiss cheese. No legitimate journalist would touch this once they understood the actual facts. But I'll send her a cease and desist letter explaining the legal consequences of harassment and defamation, just to make sure she understands her position." Victoria's threats evaporated immediately after Harold's letter arrived. I never heard from her again. Though Marcus Webb's final report indicated that she'd eventually moved back to Arizona and was working at a call center while living with her elderly parents. The boys' slow recognition. Throughout their sophomore year of college, Jake and Ryan began reaching out to me sporadically. Not asking for money, they seemed to have finally understood that bridge was permanently burned, but seeking something harder to define. Approval, maybe. Or just acknowledgement that they existed. Their messages started formal and apologetic. "Hope you're doing well. Just wanted to let you know I made Dean's List this semester." Gradually, they became more personal. "Saw a guy working on a motorcycle today and thought about those weekends you spent teaching me basic mechanics. I realize now how patient you were with my questions." Eventually, they began sharing the hard-earned wisdom that only comes from genuine struggle. "Working 2 jobs while taking a full course load is brutal. I don't know how you did it for 12 years while raising us. I understand now why you were tired all the time." I responded to their messages politely but briefly. I wasn't cruel, but I wasn't warm either. They were learning important lessons about life, responsibility, and consequences, and I wasn't going to interfere with that education by offering false hope about our relationship. The breakthrough came during their junior year when Jake called me directly for the first time since the adoption. "Dad," he said, his voice nervous but determined, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, and I'm not looking for money or help or anything like that, but I'm getting married next summer." I was genuinely surprised. Married to whom? "Her name is Emma. She's a nursing student. We've been together for 2 years and, well, she's amazing. She's taught me a lot about what real love and commitment look like." "Congratulations," I said, and meant it. "The thing is," Jake continued carefully, "I know you're not legally my father anymore, and I know we screwed up that relationship badly, but you raised me for 17 years, and those were the years that made me who I am. The good parts of who I am, anyway." "What are you asking, Jake?" "I'm asking if you would consider walking me down the aisle. Not as my father, exactly, but as the man who taught me how to be a man. Emma says it's important to honor the people who shaped us, even if the relationships are complicated." I was quiet for a long time, processing the request and my own feelings about it. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "That's all I can ask for." 2 weeks later, Ryan called with a similar request, though his was more practical. I'm graduating summa cum laude, he said without preamble. Full scholarship to grad school at Stanford for computer science. And I wanted to tell you because, well, because you're the one who bought me my first computer when I was 8. You're the one who sat with me for hours debugging my terrible early programs. That's excellent news, Ryan. I'm proud of your accomplishment. The thing is, he continued, the graduation ceremony allows each student to invite 2 people. Emma is Jake's +1, so he can't come. Mom burned her bridges with us too, in a different way, and Victoria obviously isn't an option. So you're alone? Unless, look, I know this is complicated, I know we hurt you badly, and I know we don't have the same relationship we used to have, but you were there for every important moment of my life until I was 17. It feels wrong to have this moment without you there. I thought about all the school plays, soccer games, science fairs, and parent-teacher conferences I'd attended over the years. All the small moments that had seemed routine at the time, but now felt precious in memory. I'll be there, I said. The wedding and graduation. Jake's wedding was small but beautiful, held in a park overlooking the Columbia River. Emma was indeed amazing, warm, intelligent, and clearly devoted to Jake. More importantly, she seemed to bring out the best in him. The young man I saw at that altar was someone I recognized, not the arrogant teenager who had dismissed me in court, but the thoughtful, caring boy I'd raised. When Jake asked me to walk him down the aisle, I saw tears in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered as we reached the altar, for everything, for raising me, for teaching me right from wrong, and for being here today, even though I don't deserve it. You're working to deserve it, I replied quietly. That's what matters. Emma hugged me after the ceremony. Jake talks about you all the time, she said. About the lessons you taught him, the sacrifices you made, the example you set. He knows he messed up badly, but he spent the last 3 years trying to become worthy of the father who raised him. Ryan's graduation was equally emotional. Seeing him walk across that stage, summa cum laude, full scholarship to Stanford, was a proud moment despite everything that had happened between us. When he found me in the crowd afterward, he was beaming. I did it, he said simply, and I did it the way you taught me, through hard work and perseverance, not shortcuts or promises. I'm proud of you, I said, and meant it completely. The present day. It's been 5 years since the adoption, 3 years since Jake's wedding, and 2 years since Ryan started his PhD program at Stanford. Our relationships have evolved into something I never expected. Not father and sons exactly, but something more complex and perhaps more honest. Jake and Emma have a 1-year-old daughter named Grace. Jake is working as a financial advisor and has built a small but successful practice helping young families plan for their futures. The irony of him working in financial planning isn't lost on either of us, but he's good at it, partly because he understands firsthand the consequences of bad financial decisions. Ryan is thriving in his doctoral program and has already published 2 papers on artificial intelligence applications. He's also in a serious relationship with a fellow grad student named Maria, and they're talking about marriage after they finish their degrees. Both of them have learned to value things differently now. They drive used cars, live in modest apartments, and make careful financial decisions. They work hard for everything they have, and they appreciate things in a way they never did when they were taking my sacrifices for granted. They include me in their lives in small but meaningful ways. Jake sends me pictures of Grace and updates about his business. Ryan calls me when he hits major milestones in his research. They both remember my birthday and major holidays with thoughtful messages. But we all understand that the relationship has boundaries now. I'm not their emergency contact or their financial safety net. I'm not the person they call when they need advice about major life decisions. We're friendly, but we're not family in the traditional sense. Sarah and I got married 2 years ago in a small ceremony in Bend. Jake and Ryan were invited and attended, but they weren't in the wedding party. They were guests, like old friends who had once been closer, but now occupied a different space in my life. The inheritance money has continued to grow through careful investments. Sarah and I live comfortably, but not extravagantly. We travel, pursue hobbies, and support causes we care about. I've established a scholarship fund at Portland Community College for students from single-parent households, a way to honor my father's legacy while helping young people who remind me of my younger self. The lessons learned. People often ask me if I have regrets about how I handled the situation. Would I do anything differently if I could go back? The honest answer is no. Jake and Ryan needed to learn that choices have consequences, that family loyalty matters, and that real success comes from hard work rather than manipulation or shortcuts. They couldn't learn those lessons while I was cushioning them from the results of their decisions. By refusing to rescue them from the mess they'd created, I forced them to develop resilience, work ethic, and genuine appreciation for the things they earned. The young men they've become are stronger, more grounded, and more ethical than the entitled teenagers who rejected me in that courtroom. Would our relationship be closer if I'd forgiven them immediately and helped them financially? Probably. But it wouldn't be healthier. They needed to understand that love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior, and that being a good parent sometimes means letting your children face the consequences of their choices. Lisa contacts me occasionally, usually when she's facing some new financial crisis. She's never stopped believing that I should share the inheritance money with her and the boys, and she's never accepted responsibility for her role in manipulating them against me. I don't respond to her messages anymore. Some relationships are too broken to repair. Victoria disappeared from our lives completely after the cease and desist letter. According to Marcus Webb's final reports, she eventually found work as a real estate agent in Phoenix, making a modest living selling starter homes to young families. The irony that she's now helping people buy the kind of modest houses she once looked down on isn't lost on me. The current question. Which brings me to why I'm posting this story on Reddit. Last month, I received a letter from Jake and Ryan, not individually, but together, the first time they'd contacted me jointly since the adoption. They've both achieved significant milestones. Jake's business is successful enough that he's considering opening a second office, and Ryan has been offered a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at MIT. They're both financially stable, in healthy relationships, and building the kind of lives that their grandfather would have been proud of. But they've also calculated what they lost by forfeiting the inheritance. With compound interest and investment growth, their share of the trust fund would now be worth approximately $2.8 million. Their letter was carefully written and respectful. They acknowledged their mistakes, accepted responsibility for their choices, and expressed genuine appreciation for the lessons they'd learned through struggle. But they also made a request. Would I consider gifting them a portion of the inheritance money, not as an entitlement, but as a gesture of reconciliation and investment in their proven responsibility? They pointed out that they've demonstrated financial maturity, family commitment, and personal growth. They've built successful lives without expecting handouts, and they've included me in their major milestones despite the complicated history between us. They're not asking for the full amount. They understand that ship has sailed. But they're wondering if there's a way for my father's money to serve its original purpose of helping his grandchildren, even if the path to that outcome has been more complicated than anyone anticipated. Sarah thinks I should consider it. She points out that the boys have genuinely changed, that they've learned the lessons I wanted them to learn, and that holding on to anger indefinitely serves no one's interests. Harold thinks I should be cautious. He reminds me that I've already been generous by maintaining any relationship with them at all, and that I have no obligation to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices, even if they've learned from those consequences. My friends are split. Some think the boys have earned a second chance through their demonstrated growth and maturity. Others think that giving them money now would undermine the very lessons that their struggle has taught them. The question for Reddit. So I'm asking for your perspective, Reddit. Am I the asshole if I continue to refuse to share the inheritance money with Jake and Ryan? They've grown into good men who have learned valuable lessons about life, family, and responsibility. They've included me in their lives despite the complicated history between us. They're asking respectfully, not demanding, and they've demonstrated that they can handle money responsibly. But they're also the same people who rejected me as their father in favor of a con artist who promised them easy money. They're the ones who signed legal documents declaring that I was inadequate and limited. They're the ones who participated in a scheme to defraud me of my role as their parent. Is personal growth enough to erase the consequences of betrayal? Should forgiveness include financial restoration? Or are there some choices that are so fundamental that they define the relationship permanently, regardless of later regret? Part of me wonders if giving them money now would be enabling the same mindset that got them into trouble in the first place. The belief that there's always someone else who will bail them out of their mistakes. Another part of me recognizes that they've genuinely changed, and that my father would probably want his grandchildren to benefit from his legacy, even if the path was more complicated than he anticipated. I'm genuinely torn, Reddit. These young men have become people I respect, even if our relationship will never be what it once was. But I also believe that some consequences should be permanent, that some bridges can't be rebuilt, and that integrity sometimes requires maintaining boundaries, even when it would be easier to forgive and forget. What would you do in my situation? Am I being unnecessarily cruel by maintaining my position, or am I being appropriately firm about the importance of consequences? Is there a middle ground that acknowledges their growth, while still maintaining the boundaries that their choices created? Update number 1. I should clarify a few things based on the comments I'm seeing. First, yes, I legally could give them the money if I wanted to. The trust fund is now entirely mine with no restrictions. Second, they're not in financial distress. Both are doing well for young professionals, but they're not wealthy. Third, This isn't about them needing the money for survival. It's about whether their demonstrated maturity and growth warrant a second chance at the inheritance they forfeited. Update number 2. Some people are asking about my relationship with Grace, Jake's daughter. I am her grandfather biologically, but not legally since Jake is no longer my legal son. I see her occasionally when Jake visits, and she's a delightful child, but I maintain the same boundaries there that I do with Jake and Ryan. I'm not her emergency contact, I'm not contributing to her college fund, and I won't be the grandfather she can count on for financial support. That may seem harsh, but it's consistent with the choices that were made. Update number 3. For those asking about my current financial situation, Sarah and I are very comfortable. We live well, but not extravagantly. We travel when we want to, and we don't worry about money. I've established charitable trusts, funded scholarships, and made sure that my father's legacy is being used for positive purposes. The question isn't whether I need the money, I don't, but whether Jake and Ryan have earned the right to it, despite their legal rejection of me as their father. I'll probably give this decision a few more weeks before making a final choice. The perspectives here have been helpful, even the harsh ones. Sometimes you need strangers on the internet to help you see situations clearly. Thanks for reading this incredibly long story, and thanks for the thoughtful responses. This has been one of the most difficult situations of my life, and I appreciate having a place to think through it openly.